Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vickie Lan, and in each episode, I and a guest will unpack a trope with an eye for world building, character development, or narrative structures. You can also join the conversation on TikTok and Instagram. For those times when the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. Okay, Emily, what is a romance trope that you're kind of over and you're just ready to throw in the trash?
Oh my gosh, that's quite the icebreaker. Just jump right in. Um, I'll tell you what I'm kind of over. I'm kind of over enemies to lovers when they aren't really enemies. That
Describe. That's interesting.
so I feel that enemies to lovers has become an incredibly popular trope. You see it everywhere, and I love a real enemies to lovers. Like when they really can't stand each other, and the stakes are incredibly high on both sides. And they truly, really are enemies, whether they're on the opposite side of a conflict or on the opposite side of something moral, whatever it is. But I think sometimes it gets overused when people aren't truly, really enemies. Maybe they just don't agree on something or they're not getting along right now. Or maybe it's not so much that they're enemies, but they're perhaps rivals. And so I think that, and I've seen this, kind of in the conversation as well in the
Hmm.
romance world, where people are like, give me more true enemies to lovers when that's really what it is. I think there's definitely a place for those sort of intermediary places, like rivals to lovers and that type of a thing. But I think that sometimes we go into a book and we are expecting the true enemies to lovers trope, and because of that, we're expecting them to be here and waiting for them
Yeah.
here. And so that for me, I want to see more true enemies to lovers. Make it happen. Real enemies to lovers.
Reminds me of when I was reading Fourth Wing because I don't know if you've read it, but I felt like the main character and Xaden, I think is how you say his name, weren't truly enemies other than the fact that everyone kept telling her that he is an enemy. He's gonna kill you, he's gonna do all these things to you, and of course he doesn't do any of those things. So I find that's a really good point. What is a good example of a true enemies to lovers in your mind?
Oh, that's a really, of course, now that you say this, it's like I've never looked at actual enemies to lovers in my entire life. So, what I think about is I made a whole list of like all of these different, here, this is perhaps a good example. It's an old example though, right?
Okay.
So I would maybe take the original Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series, which is Laurel K. Hamilton. It's an old
Mhm.
series, and the series has morphed and changed greatly. It's 20 plus years old. But when that book begins, we have Anita Blake, who is a necromancer and vampire hunter, right?
Mhm.
And then we have this guy who's perhaps in line to be the head vampire of the city, right? And he is obviously into her romantically. And she is like, my job is to kill you. I am a vampire executioner. I am a vampire hunter. It's in the title of the book, Anita Blake, Vampire Hunter, right? They call her the executioner. And so, they are truly on opposite sides of this whole thing because her job is to exterminate his kind because they're dangerous. And over the course of the series, she begins not only to see him as a potential love interest, but to see nuance where there was no nuance about who are vampires. Are they all the enemy? Are they all automatically bad? Do I need to rethink my position? Do I need to rethink what I do? And as that happens, and as she becomes closer and closer to him, no spoilers, sorry, it's a really old series. But we begin to see her begin to noodle around and question all of her moral stances about what she believed inherently to be true when the series began. And she moves from someone who there is no way in the world she would ever consider this creature that's the epitome of what she's supposed to wipe from the planet as her lover to this is, sorry, spoilers, sorry, old series. This is the dearest person in the world to me, or one of them, right?
Gotcha.
So that to me is super, super high stakes because they are predisposed to despise each other. Except for it's interesting to me because he doesn't necessarily see her as the enemy, even though really she truly is. And as they become closer, there's a lot of politics to negotiate. So I have always kind of found that fascinating.
So it sounds like there's a parallel between the romance shifting from enemies to lovers and a character development, a growth, because she had to overcome certain ways of thinking for her to reconcile being with him. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, it really is a situation with the true enemies to lovers where, in the case of Violet and Xaden in Fourth Wing, it's not necessarily that there was anything personally that they had against each other, but it was what had been done to them, whether it
Hmm.
was her brother dying or whether it was his father dying or all of these different. It's been a while since I read Fourth Wing, although it's lurking in the background there. I actually can probably see it. But so because of their family history, they were predisposed to regard each other as enemies. Um, and so that's another kind of enemies to lovers in a way, right? Where and I didn't have a problem buying that so much because we do carry our inheritances with us.
Hmm.
And so I could see it being, your mother did this terrible thing, not only to my father, but to all of these other people as well. And, because of you and your father, my brother is dead, right? So that's very personal, right? In terms of family stakes and in terms of almost societal stakes in a way, because it's the linchpin on which their society operates. Um, but simultaneously, nothing has happened between the two of them to make
Hmm.
it personal. So, I think you can do enemies to lovers so many different types of ways. The stakes can be highly personal, or the stakes can be generational, or the stakes can be societal. But is like I said, I think I'm always hungry to see it where two people, like you said, are on opposite sides of a divide, and something needs to shift or change
Hmm.
in terms how they understand each other. For example, like even if you go into sort of the movie realm, right? And you're thinking about what was it? You've Got Mail, I think, that movie, which is based in a book. So maybe we're okay. But if you have a situation where you've got an independent, I hope this is the right book, you've got an independent bookseller.
Hmm.
You have the guy who's moving in with the big corporate Fox Books, FOX,
Yeah.
all of the other stuff that's going on aside, they're set up to kind of be enemies because she wants her independent bookstore to survive no matter what. And it's not only important to her for ideological reasons, but it's her mother's memory that makes it important.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, I need to prove myself to my father. I need to make this work. And of course, they don't initially realize that it's each other that they're falling for, but both ideologically and then on a personal level, in terms of what matters to them, they're on opposite sides of the divide. And so, again, it's that nothing is as black and white as it seems, everything is shades of gray. So, how do we come together despite the fact that your gigantic store is putting this independent bookstore that I love so much out of business? You know?
I love that perspective. Also, I feel like we have really successfully kicked this episode off on a great start because we're getting the ball rolling here. Before we move on, Emily, can you please introduce yourself and share with our listeners some of your recent projects?
Absolutely. So, aside from apparently being a person who's never read a romance book when asked what is my favorite overdone trope, so I'm that person. That's me. I am an author. I am a book coach, and I am a writing teacher too. And I write in a lot of different genres because apparently I can't make up my mind. So I like to say that I write swoony books with a supernatural edge. They all have that in common. So I have books that are more kind of book clubby with a steamy, sexy edge to them.
Ooh.
I have a upper YA dystopian romantasy series, which is my Seven Sins series that I love so much. I always say it's kind of like Divergent meets Fourth Wing. If they got together and had a love child, but there were no dragons, it would be that book, that series. And then I am really excited I have a book releasing on December 10th called Fate and Fury, and it is a Slavic inspired romantasy that I am incredibly excited about. That's my own heritage as well. So to be able to set a book with that backdrop to me was just so thrilling and so much fun. And yeah, December 10th, Fate and Fury hits the shelves. So I'm pretty excited.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. You sound like you definitely know what you're talking about, and I can't wait to hear more from you. So, romantasy. You mentioned romantasy a couple times. Is romantasy having a moment, or has it always been here? We've just given it that term.
I mean, yes to both of those things. It is definitely having a moment. I think it's having a series of moments that are strung together over time.
Okay.
I also think that there were things that were romantasy before we had a term for it, So it's kind of a muddy area when people are like, well, what is fantasy romance versus what is romantic fantasy? And then, well, what is paranormal romance? And okay, what is urban fantasy romance? It gets a little muddy, but I do think that, with the amazing success of Sarah J. Maas's books, of
Hmm.
course, with Carissa Broadbent's success, with L.J. Andrews' success, and there are so many other big names. But I think, and of course, Fourth Wing goes without saying, it really brought to the fore, I think, this concept that readers, pardon me, are so hungry for stories that combine the intense, well done, imaginative world building of fantasy with epic love stories. And I think, it becomes such an exciting thing because then you can venture into looking at vampires and fae and
Hmm.
shifters and all of these different things that have long fascinated us, but you're also centering a romance at the heart of the story with an incredibly strong secondary plot. Um, and so, for me, loving fantasy as I do and loving romance as I do, it's in a way the best of both worlds. And I think that it's really exciting to see it getting that moment, that series of moments thrown together.
I like that you brought up the inclusion of a plot that is parallel to the romance. That brings to mind a TikToker. Her username is Brit in her books. She has very interesting, funny, hilarious observations about books, and she loves romance, romantasy, all those things. And she made a point recently that I think actually my cousin had also made the same exact point. So I'm wondering if this is a phenomenon that's happening, and if so, I'm curious to know your thoughts that at some point in the book, maybe 50% of the way through, the couple gets together, and then after that, the plot suffers or it gets boring. Um, what are
Mm.
some ways to keep the tension or interest? And is the speculative side of the storytelling helpful in that regard?
So I think that the speculative side is absolutely helpful in that regard because if your secondary plot is sufficiently strong that yes, we want these people to get together, but once they get together, now they are tackling the same problem that they were tackling independently all along, but they have brought their forces together to do
Mm-hmm.
it. I think that then you have how do we work together? If we were very strong characters independently, there's a reason we weren't together from the outset. It's like any romance, like it's that push pull, like, oh, I really want to be with you. Oh, it's not going to work. Oh, I really, really want to be with you. Oh, this is really not going to work, And so, like, oh, I'm with you. And of course, there's the whole nobody likes the third act breakup anymore. So
Uh-huh.
but I think that especially in fantasy, when we have a situation where either people were on opposite sides of a conflict, or sometimes they are on opposite sides of a kingdom. They want different things. They're potentially different species. Their kingdoms have been at war. I mean, so many different high stakes reasons. There's a reason that they weren't together from the beginning of the book, or we would have no tension to that point. So I think to keep it going, then you have to really look at, okay, we're together now, but for example, are we together now? But it's a situation where one of us really doesn't want this, but we forge this allegiance in order to save something. Like, for example, Carissa Broadbent's A Serpent on the Wings of Night. You see that in there where she consents to this marriage with somebody that she had feelings for, but feels like he duped her in some way. Again, sorry, spoilers. And so then there she is in this situation. And so there is still tension because it's like, what does he really want from her? Are they truly at odds? When was his honesty real? And when was it for the purpose of his agenda? And then we do have this whole secondary plot going on. And I don't want to talk too much about that book, so we'll veer away from that. But it can be, all right, do we actually want the same things or are you tricking me? Are we really together for the same reasons? Or is one of us potentially using this for gain? Are there forces that are trying to rip us apart because they know that together we can accomplish incredible things? So even though we are together, we're always in danger of losing each other. Are we literally magically stronger together? And so by separating us, the enemy has so much to gain. And then do we still kind of want different things? And so we're arguing about how to best accomplish whatever that big goal is that we've been working towards. I think the main way that it falls apart for me is if the only way that the characters were really growing as people had to do with their romance. And then
Mm.
nothing happens to challenge them at all between that and the end of the story. Because if you read a straight up contemporary romance, usually around the midpoint, they'll get together. But then those inklings of doubt, as Gwen Hayes would say, keep pulling at them and keep
Hmm.
pulling them apart. And even without the third act breakup, they still have all of that character work to do to go from what Gwen Hayes calls wholehearted, Hole, to wholehearted, Whole, right? There's work to do. So even though they're together, it's a surface together. And so that would be the only place where it would fall apart for me. If the only growth that they were doing on the page and on Romanticy was about how do we get together? And then once they're together, well, we're our best selves now. So we're going to go accomplish the plot, but we don't need to grow anymore.
Mm.
Whereas if it's like, okay, we're together, but I still haven't really dealt with the fact that I have insecurity, or I still haven't really dealt with the fact that I need to control everything, or I still haven't really dealt with the fact that like I can't really trust anyone and I trusted you enough to get together with you, but will I stay with you? What happens when these things that I haven't totally resolved pop up again? And I think that the answer of how to keep the tension going is the same as it would be for any book, which is in every chapter, you are, if you resolve one set of stakes, you're introducing another set of stakes, not in a mind blowing, where do we look? Oh my gosh, too much plot, but in
Hmm.
a each little piece of the stakes is driving us higher to the larger stake and a larger goal. And that is one thing that I think Fourth Wing did really well. I listened to the audiobook, and as I was listening to it, I think one reason that it felt so propulsive for me and so breathless for me was the moment something got resolved, something else was introduced, but the something else that was introduced didn't feel, oh gosh, better introduce something else now. It felt very much so like, oh, that is something that could happen here. Oh gosh, now what are they going to do? So that sort of breathlessness and seeing those characters that we rooted for to be together, struggling on a personal level and continuing to grow as people into the end, I think is really, really important for me as a reader. And I try to do the same as a writer.
I think that's really helpful advice for someone who wants to incorporate romance into their book. So, can we distinguish, if there is a distinction, between the romantic story arc of a romance book versus a book that has romance? Is there a difference, and does either arc need to incorporate some sort of breakup?
Right. So, like I said, there used to just standardly, oh boy, yes, I'm a writer, standardly, be a third act breakup, right? And then there was a
Yeah.
lot of pushback, like, this feels too much. Why do they have to break up? And with a contemporary romance and a straight up romance in general, right? We know we're heading for that HEA, that happily ever after. We know that, right? And so when people kind of mock romance and be like, oh, anyone could write that, I always think, it feels the opposite to me. It feels to me as if a well done romance is perhaps more challenging because the reader knows the general story structure and knows what to expect. So the job of the romance writer is to make you care so deeply about these characters that even though we understand in a contemporary romance or a historical romance the general arc, we still want to see them go through it, even though we know what the end destination will be. To me, that is like when you know the size of the room and you know the basic furniture that you're going to put in it, how do you make that journey compelling, right? And
Hmm.
so for me, a straight up romance novel, if you pulled out the romance, the book would not work anymore, right? Like
Okay.
versus something, a novel of any genre, not just speculative, but any genre, whether it's mystery, whether it is speculative, whatever it might be, if you pull out the romance and the book still works, you'd have to make some tweaks, but the book still works, then to me, the romance is not the central linchpin upon which the story spins. If you look at romantic suspense, for example, again, not speculative, but romantic suspense, there's usually a romantic storyline in there, but the focus is on the suspenseful piece of it, right? And the same with romantic fantasy. The fantasy plot line is taking the lead, and there is a romantic subplot versus fantasy romance, where that romance is at the heart of the story. And yes, everything is happening around it, but we care most deeply about seeing it through the eyes of the couple or the throuple or the whatever is going on, right? And so to me, I feel like we really, if someone wants to think about, well, how do I incorporate romance into my story? My question is always, why? Yes, romance does tend to sell really well. And so if you are a writer who is very market focused and you're really thinking with the bottom line, then I totally understand that. But I always think so. I teach this workshop called How Not to Win the Bad Sex Award.
Oh, okay. Like this bad sex scene?
Yeah, so there's an actual bad sex award in fiction. I probably mangled its name exactly, but there's a real award for that, and people win it every year. And I sometimes in my work as an editor, I'll get these beautiful books, beautiful writing. We get to the sex scene, and it's like they're afraid their mother is looking over their shoulder, right?
Oh no.
And, and then these scenes are like popping up like weeds everywhere. And I'm like, well, what happened to this beautiful story? And why is there another sex scene here? It's not serving the plot. It's not helping us move the character arc forward. And that goes to, intimacy scenes of any kind, kissing scenes. It doesn't have to be, sex scenes per se. And so I always, say to people, the romantic arc of the story is just another way for us to see these characters and get to know these characters. So it's always to me about where is the ghost that haunts your character? Where is the wound, the emotional wound at the core of your character's heart? And what lesson do they need to learn in order to move forward and become their best selves? And who is the person who's best served to help them solve that problem or to learn that lesson? For me, because romance is in all its forms, is what I love to read. I automatically, when I conceive of a story, think of the couple at the heart of it. And often I have multiple couples in my Seven Sins series. There's multiple couples, right? And everything else that happens is perceived for me through that lens. But I always encourage people if they want to include romance in their story or they want to write any kind of a romance, to think about the romantic arc the same way you think about the character arc. Why this person and why not this person? Why is the character ineluctably drawn to them? And yet, why do they feel that this person of all people is not the right person for them? If the person really is the right person for them, how is learning that lesson intimately connected to what they need to learn as a human being in order to move through the world? And how will that lesson ripple out, not just romantically, but in terms of making choices in career, making choices in strategy, making choices in the rest of their personal lives or their friendships? So for me, it really is a decision based on what drives you to write romance. Do you read a lot of romance? What's pulling you towards it? And if you feel driven to really think about it the way you would think about any other storyline, because it needs to be just as strong, just as vibrant, and it requires a very deep understanding of your character.
When you write romantasy, does that absolve you of the happily ever after ending requirement of the romance genre? Or do you
That's
still
a
have to
really good
kind of comply?
It's a very good question. I think that this is my personal opinion. Other people might disagree. Don't come for me. I think that it it gives you a little bit more leeway, but I do think that unless you're aiming for a tragic arc, that you really, at least by the end of your series, if you're writing a book, there does like just a singular book. I think there does need to be a happily for now or happily ever after in some way at the end of the story if the romantic relationship is one of the primary things that readers are rooting for first and foremost, right? Versus being a subplot. But if you're writing a series, oftentimes I feel like there's more room in romantasy for a little bit of a question mark there. Like it could be, we really want to be together but something's amiss. We really want to be together and we did make the decision to be together. And so now we're on the same page and it looks like things are going to work out. But oh no, at the very end of this book, monkey wrench is thrown in. So I think that a lot of the time when writing series, I always think about each book having its own arc and then that arc fitting into the larger arc of the series. And so what I often think about is what is going to be satisfying for your reader in terms of the romantic relationship at the end of this particular book in the series. Um, I think that your romantic interests always need to move forward together. They could be in a place where they're like, a little bit tentative, but they've made so much progress from where they were, and the reader can feel like, okay, so in the next book, it's really going to happen. They're really going to be together. They've made so much progress. Or it could be, like I said, they've made the decision where they're in a good place and they're together. So the reader's like, yes, finally, they realize they're the right people for each other. But then an external force comes in and something happens that they can't control. And that's the cliffhanger that drives us to the next book, because we're like, we so badly wanted them to be together, and finally they see that it's right too. Oh no, this thing happened, and now, because of forces beyond their control, just when we thought they were going to be together, it all falls apart. I think the most important thing is not to disappoint whatever contract you've set up with the reader. So I think it's very individual. And if you there are definitely books that I've seen and read recently where the two characters realize that they have feelings for each other in the first book, wind up together in the first book. But again, because it's fantasy and there are all of these world building elements coming in, something happens after that realization that is external, that is acting on them. And so they're together. But again, are they really together? How long will it last? Will they be able to surmount whatever it is? So as readers, we're like, oh, okay. Oh no. So again, I think anytime you start writing a book or a series, you make a contract with the reader, and it's really so individual to that book about what's going to satisfy the reader or what's going to make them feel like they've been let down.
Okay, so speaking of a contract with the reader, there's been some discussion I've seen on Book Talk, and I dabble in and out of it because I'm more in writer talk. So, and too much book talk can give me anxiety, I think, about worrying about what my authors think now. Thus, this question. There seems to be a heightened sense of backlash from readers when they read the resolution of a romance story or series and they disagree with the outcome. And that, like, what is a reasonable expectation? Is it, as an author, your work is out there now, and you like it now, the readers are bringing half of the interpretation and reaction to the story, right? It's not 100% your story anymore. Um, but is there also should there be some onus on the reader themselves to kind of accept, I guess, what a story has brought them versus maybe I don't know what they're trying to do when they try to like flood an author's comments because they're so angry about an outcome. What are your thoughts on that?
I was actually watching a book talk about this earlier today too. So
Okay.
I think that this becomes so tricky. It becomes a very tricky situation because the moment that we as authors decide that we're not just writing for ourselves, but instead we're going to put our book into the world, we lose agency over how that book is perceived.
Hmm.
And, sometimes when I read reviews of my books that are less than positive and I read what the reviews are, I always read those reviews that are less than positive because I think maybe there's something I can learn from it. What are a bunch of people saying the same thing? Maybe it's something I did that I didn't make clear. I'm always, if I can develop a thick enough skin to read them, I do read them, and I try to read them always with an open mind to see where these readers are coming from, because a lot of them, are very articulate about what troubled them. I don't always agree, and sometimes I wish I could be sitting next to them and be like, oh no, you misunderstood. I meant this. Maybe if you understood I meant this, you wouldn't have felt that. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disappoint you. So I think that it becomes a very difficult situation because books are so subjective.
Hmm.
In terms of reading reviews of my books, I have a book that's coming out, like I said, in December. And so early reviews are coming in, and it's so curious to me how, with the same exact thing that people will notice, one person will say, I noticed this, and I hate when this happens, and it really bothers me, which they're completely entitled to. And somebody else will say, I noticed this, and I love this so much, and I'm so glad that this is happening here. And it's the same thing,
Hmm.
and it could be the difference between 1 star and 5 star. It's just the difference between how the very same thing is perceived. And so I think that and both of those reads are equally valid in my mind, because readers bring themselves to the table. They bring their own perspective, their own desires, their own personal history, their own biases. And to me, when I wrote my very, very first book in 2012, what ended up resonating with readers the most, and that I got emails about, wasn't even something that I had thought that much about when I was writing the book, but yet universally almost when I would get emails about things that people liked, it was always this one thing, which had to do with that the premise around it is a ghost that managed to find his way back to his wife to keep a promise, right? And almost all of the comments that I would get would be like, I really believe that after my loved one left, that they came back and this is how. And for me, I was like, that is so beautiful. It also wasn't top of mind with what I was hoping that how I was hoping the book would reach people, but emotionally, it was universally how it resonated. And so I really think about that sometimes. And I think we do lose control over how readers feel about our books when our books go into the world. And it can be a little terrifying, like sending your kid off to kindergarten and wondering if people are going to like your child and thinking, I've done the best I can, I really hope people love them. But not everyone is going to like your child, and not everyone is going to love your book. And unless they're just being cruel for cruelty's sake, their perspectives are equally valid, right? And so I think it can be very hard as writers because we want to explain all the reasons why this wasn't what I meant, this wasn't how I felt. No, if you understood psychologically where I was going with these people, you would see that this is the only possible outcome and the only place it could have gone. But it could be anything. It could be that they have a personal negative experience with what happened. And so for them, they read that and they're like, oh no, anyone who does that is not okay. Or it could be that they're just not in a good headspace. Or it could be that they've read 10 books like that and it feels reiterative to them. So, you know, I feel like there's the book that we as authors write for ourselves. There's the book that we as authors write for ourselves, and then we hope that readers will see it in a certain way. And then there's the reality of the book that we send out into the world, and we have to just step back and be like, now it's not just mine, now it's ours, and we're in conversation about it. And you may not love it, and you are entitled to your perspective. And isn't it interesting as human beings how two people can do or read the same thing and feel completely opposite ways? There have been best-selling books that I've read and thought, gosh, I don't understand. This doesn't seem whatever. And then there have been underrated books that I read and like, why isn't this
Mm.
everywhere? This is incredible. And some of that may be highly personal. So I do believe that the experience where reader meets book equals extremely personal experience. And sometimes the takeaways are things that we as authors didn't anticipate. And especially if, with a romantic relationship, people are hoping it goes one kind of a way in a
Hmm.
love triangle, let's say, and then it goes a different kind of a way, and then it becomes a character judgment. How could they not see that he, she, or they is not good for he, she, or them? How could they not understand that, oh, I can't believe they choose this person who's trying to control them? And those are valid takes too. So yeah, I think it's tough, and it's an intensely personal relationship between reader and book.
When an author makes a choice with their story that results in a visceral, large reaction from readers, what advice do you have for authors? Because my biggest worry is that this may cause some authors to be fearful of making bold choices. Like maybe they
Yeah.
want to prevent the mob feeling. What advice do you have for that?
You know, within the realm of course, you do your research. Of course, you try to write in such a way that is well informed, that is all the things. Let's just, caveat, you've done all the things to the best of your ability, right? Whatever those things are for your particular story, you have done the things. So hopefully you're not in a situation where from the very outset, you're right as an author to tell this book is in question because of other choices that you've made. That's a whole other conversation. But if we're not having that conversation and we're having a conversation about, okay, this is a choice that I don't know within the context of this story, readers are going to resonate with. I think the answer is always, is this what's truest to the story? Is this what's truest to the characters? Why this choice? And why do we think that this choice is going to upset people? Is it because we think people will think we're only doing it for shock value? Is it because people desperately wanted this character to live And now they're like, you killed this character. Oh, I am done. Obviously not a main character, but you know what I mean. And so I think that within the confines of having done the work to ensure that this is a story that you are in the proper place to be telling, it's really important to think about, why am I making this choice? Is this choice the absolute best choice for the story? Have I played out and gamed out 4 or 5 different other choices? What if this happened? Try that. How does this work? What if this happened? Okay, try that. And then my advice is usually to share that with beta readers and ask them that question. How do you feel about this choice? And sometimes, a strong reaction is not always a bad reaction. In my art group right now, I've started a support group jokingly for one of the chapters in my book because as soon as everybody gets to that chapter, they're like, "What have you done? I am good." And so I said, "Okay, consider this your support group for chapter X," and they're like, "Oh, thank goodness." And they're all weighing in, "I need help," So but they're not necessarily mad at me. I mean, they might be momentarily mad at me, but it's more like there's a difference between being deeply emotionally affected, having a visceral reaction, and being very invested, to feeling disgusted and disappointed with the author and feeling like this choice was the easy way out. This choice was lazy. This choice was the author didn't want to do the work. This choice destroyed everything that the author was building up over the course of these books.
I've heard that one. Yes, I don't have examples right off the top of my head, but I definitely have read long series where they say, "Wait, she threw the whole point of what everything was building up to out the door." And so when criticisms like that happen, what do you think happened on the author side? Was it a change in direction? Um, Maybe it wasn't plotted from the beginning?
I think a couple of things. There's multiple answers to that, I feel. One answer could be, if it's a long series and it takes a while for the author to write it, the author that starts book one is not the same author that writes book 6 or 7.
Hmm.
What they want, how they feel, how they write, what they value, the reason that they're writing this series, all of these different things, you're not the same human being. I know that when I started book one of my Seven Sins series, to when I wrote the last one, I wasn't the same writer, and I had to really think about, how am I going to keep this so that it appeals to the same readers while simultaneously honoring my growth as a writer. So I think that's one. I think another, it can happen also because people didn't plot necessarily, and you don't have to plot. There's no one way to do this, but a challenge of not plotting in advance is that you can sometimes find yourself with longer series painted into a corner. And so, in order to accomplish really big thing A, B, C, D, E, F, and G in the next book or at the end of this book, you've got to get this character out of the way. Right. And
Mm.
so, but if you get this character out of the way, people who've been with you since the beginning will be like, I love so and so. How could you do this? Even though they were only a secondary character, like we were with them from the very beginning. We saw them grow from a shy whatever, whatever into this badass whatever, whatever. And we love them. And now they're gone. Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for nothing. So I think that can happen. I also think sometimes authors can feel like stuck. I don't know what to do now. And there's always there's that joke about, well, if you don't know what to do to keep your plot interesting, kill somebody off, Um, it does keep the plot interesting, but at the expense of what, right? So I think
Yeah.
sometimes, especially when you have a very intricate story and the book has been going and going and the series has been going and going, you're like, well, now what? This person has had their house burnt down. This person has had XYZ traumatic thing happen. This person has shapeshifted into 20 creatures. This person has ridden on the back of, a bat through the skies, like whatever it is. They've done everything. They've lost everyone. They have metamorphized in all these ways. What do I do with them now? How can I? And I think sometimes too, it can be about the growth of the main character. Like, let's just say, I'm going to make this up, because I don't have a real example, but literally something I'm making up right now. You've got a main character who was perhaps depending on the one person, not necessarily a romantic interest, that they let into their heart, right? This one person that they trusted. And because of this one person, they could never do the stuff that they needed to do to grow and change and become their best selves and stand on their own 2 feet, stand alone and accomplish that next level of growth. Maybe they need to lose that person.
Mm.
Like now my support is gone and I am heartbroken and I am devastated, but only now without that do I really find out if I can lead on my own, if I can
Oh,
do whatever,
the
if I can
doomed mentor trope. You got to get rid of that
right.
mentor. Yeah.
Gotta get rid of the mentor. Sometimes it's the best friend.
Hmm.
And so if that person has been with us since the very beginning, because it could be a mentor or trainer, but it could also be someone who's just, it could be an aunt, a grandma, someone in a parental role, a bestie. If this person has been with our main character since the beginning, and instead of solving our problems ourselves, our main character is always like, so and so, what do I do? And so is the problem solver who makes it okay. The reader is probably immensely invested in so and so who always shows up, and they probably empathize and identify with so and so
Yeah.
for the main character to grow. Bye bye, so and so.
Yeah.
So I could see readers being big mad because like, how could you kill so and so? We love them. But only now can main character have true main character energy and be like, all right, even without so and so, I'm going to do the big bad important thing.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so then kind of almost backing up a little bit and summarizing a lot of the things that we've just said here. If I were to hand you a book blindly, a book you've never read before, it's got romance, it's got speculative. Can you pick up on context clues that tell you, oh, I'm reading a happily ever after. Oh, I'm reading a doomed romance. Are you able to kind of pick that out from Act One, or do you have to kind of complete the journey to really start to pick and choose and combine, oh, here are the stakes and, the character arcs looks like it's going to form in this direction.
I think that you can tell a lot from the first chapter. So if your first chapter is done well, you should be able to A, really care about the characters. B, if it is romantasy, you've either met the other love interest or you're about to meet them at the beginning of the second chapter. So you can see a bit of the
Okay.
dynamic, right? I'm trying to think back to Fourth Wing and if it's the end of the first chapter that she meets Zayden when she's going across, if it's the beginning of the second, it's been a while. But even if they don't know that they're
Mm,
meeting, if only one of them sees the other, right? We still know the dynamic between them. We should know your main character's goal, what the thing that they want more than anything else. We should have a sense of why they can't meet that goal and what will happen if they don't. So the stakes, right? And we should be able to see how far apart are these romantic characters in terms of these things, right? Um, I feel like there's a lot that you can tell from the beginning, but I tend to, by the time I get to the middle, is when I'm kind of like, all right, so here we are. I've read 50% of the way through. This is the midpoint. So ideally, it's the height of whatever is happening between them romantically. It's either that false victory or that false defeat, right?
okay.
And I think that's what I'm really looking for. Is it the false victory or is it the false defeat? And I'm looking at the plot elements and how the plot arc and the character arc are marching in lockstep because I'm always thinking about how are they in a romantasy? They're kind of equal. So how are they serving each other? And okay, I see where the plot is going. So in order for the plot to get where it's going, what has to happen for these characters and how does that impact the romance? Okay, I see how the romance is going. But if it's perhaps necessary, like let's say that you have two characters who are in love but can't touch each other because if they do, the world will explode, right? And of course, we don't want the world to explode, but we also really want them to be in love. So we're always looking for that kind of push pull. And so when I'm reading, I think I'm often thinking about, is this a series? So if this is a series, how is this going to play out in general? What is the expected arc for book one? And by the middle, you can probably tell where that arc is going, but I'm still looking for twists and turns that are showing me where this is going to lead. And I'm wanting to be surprised. Um, I think that generally in like romantasy, for example, if your two main characters are really truly together with no obstacles by the end of book one, then the rest of that series needs to be absolutely strong enough to carry without any sort of, you need to introduce another source of tension between those characters. Like they're together, but they're going to be removed to opposite sides of the realm and they can't get to each other. Like, but that is, I think, an implosion of a happily ever after because even though they want to be together, they're not together. So I think it's very rare in a romantic series, in my experience, to have the two main characters together with their permanent happily ever after with no obstacles at the end of book one, even if they have made the decision that they want to be with each other. Like I said, something is happening or is going to happen that's going to create increasing tension, whether it's the introduction of somebody else, like an old flame, or whether it's, like I said, they've been separated, or maybe one of them is cursed, or whatever it could be. Um, and that is part of what keeps the reader going, but you need to be very careful as to not do it in such a way that the reader is like, okay, this is just like falsely externally imposed upon it for the sake of creating tension. Now I'm annoyed. I'm so annoyed,
Mm,
right? It needs to feel believable. It's walking a very fine line between like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened to them. I'm rooting for them. They need to surmount this. And oh, for the love of God, they were just together. Like, isn't this convenient? It flew down from the sky, a meteor landed on them, and now they're on opposite sides of the gap and they can't cross. So I think it's a very delicate balance, but I usually do not expect by the end of book one in a romantasy for characters one and two to be together with no obstacles, unless it's been very clear to me from the outset from the author that book two is going to be from another couple's perspective. And there are series that do that. So Carissa Broadbent, again, since we were talking about that, her Nyaxia books, the first two in Serpent and the Wings of Night, that's a particular couple. But then it switches over. It's the same with L.J. Andrews and the Ever King, right?
mhm.
Focused on, Livia and Eric and whatever might happen with them. And then we have other books that are within the same world, switches over. So how long you can, in my opinion, how long you can string out a romantic arc between whether it's a couple, a throuple, whatever, how long you can string out the main romantic arc should only be as long as it serves the plot and the plot serves it. Sometimes that's just a duology. Sometimes that's one book. Sometimes that's four books. It really, in my mind, depends. And I feel like the kiss of death comes when the romantic slash character arc and plot arc are not marching in lockstep. So one gets extended beyond the other, and that's where readers get frustrated.
Wow, Emily, you are so knowledgeable, and I've learned so much from you. I don't write romance. I have romance in my books,
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
but I learned so much. So now I like to jump genres too. I'm currently writing a Western, not a traditional Western because it's different. It's a little bit more contemporary in mind. But I just know myself. I was in sci-fi before that, and now I'm like dabbling in Western, and I'm gonna find myself over to the romance genre. So
Yeah.
so you mentioned that in your coaching and editing, do you provide editing services for people that want you to kind of review?
I do. So I am a certified author accelerator coach. So I do both. So that kind of expands beyond editing to working with authors. It could be anything from, Emily, I have an idea. Can we talk my idea through and see if this idea has legs? And is this enough of an idea for a book? Or it could be, hey, I want to write this book, but I really need to think about the structure. Can you be there? Okay, it can be sometimes being accountability. It can be working through thorny plot issues. It can be, hey, okay, send me 10 pages a week and we'll meet and we'll talk about your challenges and where you're stuck. It can be, I'm trying to query and I can't get my query letter right. And so it can span kind of a wide range. And then I do also just do straight up editing, where I will work with folks either to developmentally edit their manuscript, or to also sometimes do a line edit with them as well, depending on how much they need. And I really love doing that too, because it's just a joy for me to help authors take a vision that they care so much, so deeply about, and develop it. And sometimes, I personally love revisions. I know a lot of people hate revision, can't stand it. I love revisions so much. So it's also a joy to me to get a manuscript where someone's like, okay, I've done this. I've been working on it, but now I'm banging my head against the wall. Something's not right. And I don't know what this something is. And I've given it to my beta readers and they say three different things. And I sent it out to query and people say it has potential, but I don't know. I'm stuck. Help. That's one of my favorite things in the world, to really work through the revision process with authors and find those pain points, to try and shape books to become the best that they can be.
I love that. All right, well, we're coming up on time. So, how can our listeners find you if they want to learn more, buy your books, or seek out your services?
Oh, absolutely. So my website is just emilycolin.com. So Colin .com. So my editorial services are there, but also all of my books are there. You can sign up for my newsletter there if I didn't talk enough for you here and you want to get more of me. And then you can find me on Facebook and on Instagram and sometimes on TikTok. And I am at Emily Colin Books on all of those places. And I am also that on Threads.
All right. Well, thank you so much again, Emily, for joining me today. I learned so much from you. It's very entertaining, very educational, and I hope our readers also feel, our listeners also feel the same way. So, thanks, listeners, for tuning in. It's always a joy having you guys join us every week. I'll have another episode next week, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.